Thanks everyone for coming to this talk on layered Azure Landing Zones. So again, just to recap for people, my name is Dylan. I'm a principal solution consultant at Person, focus on platform engineering, DevOps, and DevX in Microsoft domain. Also MVP for developer tools and DevOps. And I started off my career as a .NET developer, so I've seen kind of the whole progression from development and how we deal with developing things, deploying them, and then moving over to the side that's actually handling those deployments and seeing cloud infrastructure, things like that. And I'm an all-around tech enthusiast, passionate about AI and emerging tech. Cool. All right, so let's get started. So what's really the problem we're talking about here is that landing zones feel hard, and it's not always the case. It's kind of like they feel hard, but then when you get into the environment, they're often really complex. You've got lots of moving parts. You've got lots of infrastructure as code if you've got to that stage. Lots of people touching the same thing. And then they become really hard to manage because you've got lots of different owners, different tools. So you've got security teams, you've got your cloud teams, you have your application teams, and they're all trying to manage the same things. And that makes it really slow to change. So when you need to actually make a change to your landing zone, like you need to add a new area to the landing zone, or you need to update some governance, it becomes this huge issue of trying to coordinate everyone into the same thing, know where the effects are going to land of what you're changing. And then that just slows things down, like delivery. So it takes ages for that to come through. There's risky changes because someone may have changed something. They're not aware of the impacts on other parts of the landing zone. And then that ownership component. So who actually owns this part of the landing zone and the change that's going through. So what's actually wrong here? Well, it's not actually the complexity that's issued. It's coupling. So if we look at all of these kind of layers, like the idea of a layers where we have our networking, we have governance, we have our application, so these things are all very tightly integrated. So if you make one change, it's going to really likely affect a lot of these different areas all at once. But we've seen this before. We've seen this issue with coupling before. And it's from software development. If we look back at software development, we've seen systems where they're tightly coupled and they cause all sorts of issues with how do we manage that coupling. And we came up with this idea of the separation of concerns, where we want to have each part of a system should address a separate concern. So really what we should be doing is looking at how we manage that in software and thinking, well, how do I apply that to the cloud? Can we start to separate things by their concerns of things like networking, governance, and the application layer? And do we want to try and separate each team out to that as well? So the shift that we're looking at here is that we've got our kind of monolithic infrastructure as code, where we've got our networking, governance, application, and everything's all interconnected. One change can break many things, and teams feel constantly blocked by waiting for other teams or trying to all manage the same thing. And what we're actually looking at doing then is looking at, okay, we want to separate these concerns out. So we've got our networking layer, where we have our connectivity, our network topologies, our segmentation, and that's all managed by a special networking team. Because this could also include things like connecting back to on-prem, all part of that same layer. Then we have our governance layer. So this is where we're looking at how a policy is applied to our Azure environment. How are we ensuring compliance? What guardrails are we putting in place? What are the structures of the management groups? All of that kind of thing is all managed on its own layer rather than trying to fit that in with, say, the networking layer. And then finally, we have our application layer. So this is where we're actually looking at our workloads, our services, development tools, all this kind of stuff that would sit on top of these other two layers. So again, you've got your core networking, and your application obviously needs to use that networking. You've got your governance layer, which is adding in those guardrails and that kind of shaping of confining what can and can't be used within an environment, so that the application is made sure it's using the right things that have been approved. So the idea is we really want to be separating these things out so that each layer does effectively one job. And through this, we also want to reduce what we call cognitive load. So when you're looking at a layer, you don't really want to have to think about what are the other layers here doing. I just want to think about the application layer, or I just want to think about the governance layer. I don't want to be sitting there having to go, well, I'm deploying an application. How do I manage the networking? Because that should really be being managed within the networking layer itself. This also then enables us to move forwards with a lot of self-service, where we have layers in place and we have things well defined enough that when we actually need to do something like add a new application, it's not a huge task because we've already got things structured in a way that we can easily add new applications on top of the existing layers. We don't have to go back through all of those layers to do that. So let's look at what a layer actually is. So a layer is an area where there's responsibility for one thing. So, and we say one thing, in this case, one reason to exist. So networking isn't just one thing. There's lots of parts of networking, but the idea of connectivity and how the cloud manages connectivity is very much that one layer. And then for that ownership, now, it could be a network team, it could be the platform team, could be integrated into that. So, but again, it's the goal of having one owner for a specific layer. And that doesn't mean that you don't have other teams giving input. So if you've got your networking layer, you might still have a security team that's giving input to say, this is how we recommend this gets set up, or this is how we want to do the firewall rules. But at the end of the day, the owner of that layer is the team that's going to be implementing those changes. The change frequency, this is also really important. How often is this layer getting changed? In the way of networking layer, may not be very much, but say in an application layer, that's going to see a lot more change a lot rapidly. And then the blast radius. So if you're making a change on a layer, you know that this is the thing I'm going to affect. So the application layer, pretty low blast radius, you're just affecting one application. Your governance layer has a larger blast radius. So you're a bit more aware of, okay, I'm going to make a change here. This is going to have impacts on the application layer and then the networking layer as well. Going to have broad impacts. So by being able to scope those blast radiuses, it gives you a good idea of what is the risk involved in doing this change, how much planning do I have to do, how much change management do I have to do, things like that. So let's dive deeper into these layers themselves and really try to figure out what does each layer actually contain. So for our networking layer, we've got our connectivity. So this is if you're using a hub and spoke model, that would be where this is, or using a virtual WAN topology, that's where you would define this core part of your networking topology. And then your routing. So how is traffic going to flow through my environment? How am I going to get connectivity from my database to my application, or from on-prem up to my application? And then DNS, how am I going to deal with naming? Do I need to account for kind of the on-prem using domain controllers and doing DNS there? And how do I want to handle that in Azure? Am I using private resolvers with private DNS zones? How am I going to connect all of that up together so that that works seamlessly without other layers having to think about that? And then private endpoints. How am I making sure that the traffic in my network stays in my network? So if I've got storage accounts, am I making sure that they are not publicly accessible and they must be routed through my actual networking layer so that I don't have traffic kind of exiting the environment constantly just to wrap around to a public endpoint? At its core, this is the foundation layer. This is what everything else in your environment will sit on. So this is the hardest change. So you do need to spend a lot of time really considering how this layer works. And it has the largest blast radius, because we all know if you change a route and suddenly you can't connect to something, doesn't matter how much governance you have over it, the application is going to fail. So this is where you've really got to put a lot of time and effort to creating that solid foundation. Layer 2 is your governance layer. So this is where you're making sure you've got your policies in place. So your guardrails, your enforcement, you're doing things like enforcing tagging. You've got specific requirements on kind of VMs, like what size they can be. You're trying to really put that barrier around the environment, say this is what we allow in the environment. We also have our RBAC, so really managing who has permissions where. So making sure the right teams have the right permissions in the right areas, making sure that kind of scales as well, because you have teams that might need to use privileged identity management so that they can escalate their roles. Is that being set up correctly? Managing all that layer, tagging itself, as we start with like requiring tagging, but is that tagging set up to allow for cost management so we can do FinOps and understand how much the environment's costing, which teams have different cost centers, which owners are for particular things as well. So, and then lastly, compliance, where we want to overlay our kind of compliance checks. Are we making sure that we're ISO 27001 compliant? Have we applied the right controls to layer over Azure to make sure of that? Are we reporting on it? Are we auditing it? And the key thing with the governance layer, though, is that we're not trying to block everything. We're not trying to put hard walls up. A lot of this stuff works just by having it in an audit mode, because what we want is information. And as Brian says here, good governance constrains, it doesn't block. So we're not here to put up brick walls when we do a governance layer, but we are here to constrain what's being used, put those guardrails in place, and make sure that the right things are happening in our environment. And lastly, we have our application layer. So this is really where the value for your platform is delivered. So at the end of the day, this is where your workloads are. So you've got your things like App Service, Azure Kubernetes Service, Azure Functions. They're all running inside this layer. But you also have your other services. So other APIs that might be there, messaging, so Service Bus, other integrations, so Fabric, and even more commonly now, Azure AI Foundry, where you're running all of your AI workloads, your agentic workloads, your data, so your databases, Fabric, storage, analytics, all gets run inside this layer as well. And this is also the layer where we're seeing the fastest change. So you're seeing new applications come in, new services get deployed, more and more requirements for adapting and creating new things. So this is the layer that we see all of that change happening. And we really need to try and make sure that when we change this layer, we can do it quickly. We're not kind of held up waiting for, oh, okay, I have to wait for the networking layer to put in this basic thing, or I've got it every time we want to do something, networking has to come in and double check. So, or governance has to come in and say, are you using the right tagging? So you really want to have set those previous layers up so that when it comes to actually deploying your application into that layer, this is the only thing that development team has to think about. They don't need to worry about those previous layers. So these layers don't live alone. They do stack essentially on top of each other. So your networking provides that connectivity, routing, DNS, private endpoints, which underpin everything else. Your governance sits on top of that with the policy, RBAC, tagging, compliance, and kind of shapes how things work within the environment. And then your application consumes those previous layers where it's using those governance layers to enforce tagging. It's using the networking layers to control communication and routing. And it just sits on top and is able to then provide those workloads and those services for those workloads to use. So when we look at it in this way, though, we're not really just looking at infrastructure anymore. We're really looking at a platform. because we're stacking things on top of each other. And that's what really we start to come down to. When we start to look at applying things in layers, we're starting to see that now we're building this platform for people to use. So in this case, where like that network is your base foundation layer, your governance is your control layer, but then after that, with the application, that's just kind of sitting on top. And that's really where we want to be with this. We want to be looking at these environments as a platform for your development teams to be able to deploy onto. And if we treat them as a platform as a whole, we start to kind of reframe how we think about delivering these to our client, which is, in this case, the development team, who then provides value to the business. So really what that looks like from like a golden path here of what you really want is you have a developer that needs a new service. There's predefined patterns on how that's done. So you will have a template, which is that pattern which the developer needs to kind of fill things out. It'll have best practices. It'll already have kind of like security, naming, tags, and that's, again, that governance layer coming into play here, so that when you deploy this template, you know it's going to deploy with these specific requirements. And then once deployed, we know that it's running and compliant. Developers are ready to start shipping to that environment. They're not having to worry about how have I set up my private endpoints, or is the routing in place and connectivity? How do I have to manage the firewalls? All of that's done in that networking layer. So from a developer point of view, you've developed a service, you've used a template to say, here's what the service is, and then you've deployed it and run it. And that's it. You're not having to think about any of that deeper layer, while the platform team looks after, does this layer exist? Have I put automation in place to be able to take that template and know how to apply it to the layer that it needs to be applied to? And can I monitor and make observable all of this environment? And this is where we come into actually the pipeline. And even though we're talking about separating these layers, and especially where we separate them in code, where we have different layers defined in our infrastructure as code, what we're not separating though is kind of the delivery of this. We're still talking about when we deliver something, it still needs to go through the layers. So if you do have a brand new application that needs new networking, there does need to be a delivery of that. But this is really where we start to look at it as it's a delivery in order. We're not trying to do everything all at once. We'll start off with the networking. We'll put that foundation in place. If it's a brand new thing that needs some specialized networking or an extension to our networking, that networking layer has to be in place first. Then we have our governance layer. Do we have the right controls? Do we need to modify controls? Do we need to adjust how we're doing tagging? Do we need to have a new cost center? Again, that's put in place before you then go and put your application in place, which then deploys on top of the previous two layers. So really, we want to make sure we're deploying in order, but each of these layers has different owners. So we can manage this in the way that we say, okay, we know that the networking layer is owned by platform, governance layer is owned by security, and the application layer is owned by the application teams. With governance, so when we say owned by security, it could be that security is defining what happens, but again, platform team is the one actually implementing that. So yeah, as I said, when we actually do those changes, there's different impacts. So yeah, new app can affect all layers where you need networking, governance, and the workload together. But when it's just a new feature, then you only need to worry about the application. Policy updates themselves only affect the governance layer. They're not going to directly change the application layer. There could be impacts on it where it will maybe cause an alert or try and constrain the environment. Then that has to be obviously looked at as a change to further parts of the environment. And then networking routing changes. Maybe you've got a new VPN that needs to put in. It doesn't actually affect the other layers, but it does need to be handled within that networking layer. So when we talk about ownership, what teams are actually owning this? So I've said a few different teams at the beginning where we say different teams have input, but who actually owns the core of this? So if we look at, we've got networking, we've got governance, and we've got application. Now, this is going to depend entirely on your organizational structure. So my answers to this are very much from the look of what I've seen within industry and what I've seen that works well within the industry. So if we start with our networking, that's your platform team. So this team has your network experts, it has your cloud infrastructure experts. So really, this is their bread and butter. This is what they're doing day to day. They are ensuring that the foundation of your platform is in place, it connects, it has all the correct routing, it has its firewalls, it has all of those components in place, observable, monitored, and they know what's happening with that environment. Governance. Now, in this case, I say platform team again, and this is back to that comment of while other teams have input, it's down to the team that implements that really owns that particular part of the layer. So in governance, even though you would have security, compliance, all coming in and saying, I want this needs to happen, or finance saying, I need this particular tagging, it's still the platform team that actually goes ahead and does that deployment and sets that up. And then lastly, the application team. In this case, we actually want to ship the ownership of this layer to the app team themselves. And we do that by providing them things like templates and patterns. But really, once we have given that to them and they have deployed their application, we want them to own this layer. Now, this doesn't mean that they own the infrastructure. What they own is things like their monitoring, their alerting. They know what their application's doing in the environment. They've got feedback from that application. So if there is issues inside the application themselves, they can surface it. But this isn't something the platform team needs to own. The platform team does need to provide the automation and essentially the base level foundation for it to sit on. But the platform team themselves don't have to own the actual applications. And this is where we see that kind of the split between what is the core part of the platform, which is your governance and networking, and then what is the actual services being deployed on top of. So what does this enable? It enables faster delivery. So we're able to do smaller, contained changes and ship quickly, especially if we're on that application layer. We're not having to constantly redefine or be worried about the other layers. We're just shipping changes to that top layer. Reduce cognitive load. So when the app team's thinking about, well, what do I need to know about this environment, they're only thinking the application layer. Governance team is only really thinking about what do I need to do within the actual governance layer here, and what are the impacts that it's going to have further on. And then the platform team with the networking layer doesn't reduce as much code. They still need to know about the whole platform, but it does mean that they don't have to know so much about the intricacies of the application and how that's all working. Safe changes, so we know what the blast radius is. When we're making a change, we know what the risk profile is. We know what the likely, if this breaks, how much does it affect further down the line. And we can really manage our kind of change management around that to make sure that everything is managed. We know if there's outages, when they're going to happen, things like that. And then we have a clear ownership. So there's no gray zones. Every part of the environment is owned by someone. And those layers have clearly defined teams who are responsible for them. Cool. So that's all enough for me talking about it. But how about I actually show you some of what this looks like? So you can see kind of what the code structure of your ISC may look like. So let's quickly just bounce.
Just to note, we've only got a couple of minutes left, so.
Yep, all good. So let me switch over this one, bounce here. Okay. My MacBook keeps deciding to hide screens from me. Alrighty. Cool. So this code will also be up on GitHub. So don't worry if you don't have time to read through what I'm showing. You will be able to go view this on a public repo in GitHub. So what we have here is we have our infrastructure folder, and this is where we start to see the separation come through. So if we look just at the base, we have our layers. So we're defining each of our layers, and this is actually where we define a lot of our core structures of what each layer, and we have specific modules, things like that. So we've got our application layer, we have our governance layer, also governance layer on top of the subscriptions themselves. So we know how we're applying that. And then we have our core networking layer. And these are kind of set, this is your base implementation here. So this is how you do the functional part of this. But what you want to then have is you want your parameters files. So in this case, we actually split them out. So we have our networking parameters. So this is where we start defining the values. So we can know what our different networks are doing and how we're slicing them up. We have our governance layer. So this is where we've got our management groups. We've got kind of any retention for workspaces in our logging. And then we also have policy assignments where we can assign those policies to specific management groups. And then we have our applications layer and with how we define these applications. And in this applications layer, this is where, in this case, is a very simple way of approaching it, but we actually have a structured way for application teams to provide what their application needs. And what we do here is we create a template, and we give this template to the developers and say, please fill this out. And when they fill that out, we can then add this to our list of applications. So when we run the pipeline to actually deploy this, it will go through and check that these applications have all been deployed. So this all then wraps up. So we've got, again, clear layers where we know things are happening. If we need to change anything foundational, we have these layers again split out. And then this means that even though it's in a mono repo and all the code's here, you're only really needing to look at what layers are you really affecting. Cool. So I'll just switch back.
I love this. There's a couple of things that come to mind when I look at this code. One is, the alignment to monorepos seem to be happening quite a lot across the industry at the moment. I think mainly due to agentic context. So, but it makes sense. So you've layered it in terms of those functions, in terms of like the governance and the networking, who they're owned by. And then there'll be a level deeper of going, okay, only run these pipelines if these files in this specific folder have changed, for example. So you don't have to go through and do the full deployment for every single thing a time application gets added. So,
exactly. So you can shift things as you need. You can use, especially so GitHub, you can use paths in your work, in your actual workflows where you're deploying that to check where changes are. It also helps you validate things and catch issues really quickly as well. Cool. So key takeaways for what we're really talking about is that complexity really isn't the problem here. The problem is coupling. So how tightly have we been coupling these things together? By splitting out these layers, we're reducing the cognitive load for teams who need to use this platform. They don't have to think about those other layers. And really, the platform enables speed and safety. So we're able to deploy quickly with confidence, knowing that our applications can land on this platform and get going without having to take a month of back and forth with all the different platform teams and trying to get everything all aligned. Cool. So, and any message I really want to leave you here is that the platform team builds the system, but the application teams are the ones that build the value. So when we're looking at platforms, we're really serving the application teams because the application teams are then serving the business. And if we start to think about it like that, it helps us kind of scope those things a bit better.
Yeah, I like that, and it doesn't compete with the cloud adoption framework either. It works side by side.
Mhm.
So
Yeah,
really good.
yeah. All of this fits within your standard cloud adoption frameworks. You're still checking off the same boxes. You're still making sure you're using the right Azure settings. You've got your firewalls, your private networking. You're using your endpoints properly. All of that good stuff.
So we're at time, but before we go to our next session of the day, how do people get in contact with you, like through social media?
Yep. So my LinkedIn is usually my most responsive. Yep, it's just there. And also there's my GitHub. So if you're looking for the code from this demo, then yeah, go check out that my GitHub there. It'll be under Azure Landing Zone. I think it's what I've called the repo. And you'll be able to see that. I'll post it up on LinkedIn anyway, post this session. But yeah, if you've got questions, feel free to message me on LinkedIn. That's where I respond the fastest. But yeah.